And so my name is Taifa Alexander, and I am the Assistant Dean of Students for Diversity and Leadership Development at Wofford College. And thank you all for joining today's session, Anti-Racism 101 and Anti-Racist Toolkit. On Tuesday, if you all were able to join us, we examined the larger historical systemic reasons for the national and international resistance in the forms of protest to better understand how years of federal, state, and local policies have placed communities of color and Black communities in particular in the crises we face today, and called those policies out for what they are, racist. And so in discussing systems of oppression and how to disrupt them, our panelists gave us some tangible but intimidating suggestions on how to disrupt these systems. And so today, our panelists, Georgetown law graduates, and some of my very, very, very good friends, attorneys Erin Keith, Maya McKenzie, and Brienne Palmer, alongside Dr. Jim Nabors, will engage in a discussion with us on how to begin the process of incorporating deliberate actions of decolonizing contemporary understandings of equity, inclusion, and allyship to develop effective methods in disrupting systems of injustice through anti-racist behaviors and actions in your daily, everyday lives. And so in framing our discussion on how to be an anti-racist, our panelists will begin by providing us with some definitions of anti-racism, then provide examples of both racist and anti-racist behavior to allow us to distinguish between the two, and discuss hypothetical scenarios where anti-racist behavior can be invoked to disrupt systems of oppression. And so a prerequisite for attending this session and for engaging in anti-racism work is a willingness and commitment to use your dominant identity to center and uplift marginalized voices as equitable partners in disrupting racist oppressive systems of inequity wherever they are present. So I thank all of you on this call for committing to that fight. And as attendees, you all had the opportunity to leave questions for our panelists in your registration form. However, you can also use the chat feature to privately send questions to our lovely host, Nadia Glover, Wofford's Inclusive Engagement Coordinator. And we will make every effort to answer all the questions, or as many questions as possible, during the Q&A portion of the session. However, it's possible that we might not be able to get to every question. But after the hour, there will be an option for session attendees to engage in breakout discussions. There will be an Anti-Racism 101 organizer in each room to help guide those discussions. And so if you do have a question that hasn't been answered, please feel free to take your discussions to your breakout sessions as well. Please note that while the panelist discussion and Q&A portion of this session is being recorded, the breakout sessions will not be recorded. Additionally, any attendee who is engaging in disrespectful, harassing, or racist behavior will be removed from this session and future sessions going forward. Now that we have all of that, we're going to go ahead and introduce our panelists. So Brienne J. Palmer is a litigation associate in the Washington, D.C. office of Paul Weiss, focusing on anti-corruption and compliance investigations. Prior to that, she served as an attorney advisor at the Arlington Immigration Court through the Department of Justice Attorney General's Honors Program from 2016 to 2018. Brienne is a 2016 cum laude graduate of Georgetown University Law Center. While at Georgetown Law, Brienne also served as the membership development and diversity editor for the Georgetown Law Journal. She is also a 2013 magna cum laude graduate of the University of Florida. As a first-generation American of Jamaican heritage, she is especially passionate about Black immigration issues as part of a global struggle for racial justice. Welcome, Brienne. Erin Keith graduated summa cum laude from Howard University in 2013 with her bachelor's in political science. She then attended Georgetown Law, where she graduated with her law degree with her JD in 2016 and LLM in 2018. She currently serves as a staff attorney in the Detroit Justice Center, where she focuses on criminal justice reform while also providing direct representation to indigent, and formerly incarcerated clients. Prior to her current work, Erin served as the Juvenile Defense and Policy Fellow for Georgetown's Juvenile Justice Initiative. In this role, Erin focused her policy research, legal advocacy, and project development on the intersection of race and gender to promote culturally responsive, youth-led juvenile justice reform. Erin is also a member of the Detroit Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. Welcome, Erin. Maya A. McKenzie graduated summa cum laude with a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from Alabama State University in 2013 and with a JD from Georgetown Law in 2017. She is currently an associate at DLA Piper LLP in Atlanta, Georgia, where she counsels multinational corporations on data privacy, regulatory, and transactional matters. Ms. McKenzie also maintains an active pro bono practice in support of voters' rights, criminal records restriction, and nonprofit governance. She is involved in her Central Alabama and Atlanta communities as a board member of Unite Inc., a nonprofit which provides academic support and mentorship to high school students in Central Alabama and college students at Alabama State. Ms. McKenzie is also a member of the Atlanta Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated and the Urban League of Greater Atlanta Young Professionals. Welcome, Maya. And last but certainly not least, Jim Nabors teaches Black American literature and culture and co-coordinates the African American Studies program at Wofford. He's a member of Wofford's Presidential Committee on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and co-directs with Dr. Bethay the Search Advocate program, which works to ensure equity during hiring processes on campus. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you, Dean Taifa. It's such an honor to be on this panel, and thank you to everyone involved in this. I would like to say a word if I could, and I'm going to have to read from notes, and I apologize for that. But I would like to take a moment, if I could, to acknowledge, all too quickly, acknowledge the work that you and Ms. Glover have done in organizing this series. By all of our calculations, this week's incredibly successful series represents now more than 150 hours of work over 8 days between the two of you, which allows for about, what I could tell, about 5 hours a day for eating and sleeping. Add to that the work your office has done in undertaking to review, edit, and provide consultation for at least 10 solidarity statements released by individual departments and organizations on campus, each of which requires substantial time and energy. All of this in 8 days. This amount of work is exhausting and under any circumstance, but it's absolutely crucial, I think, to acknowledge the particular context of Dean Taifa's and Ms. Glover's work at this moment. The context is the compounding horror of Mr. Floyd's, Ms. Taylor's, Mr. Arbery's, Mr. Scott's, Mr. Clark's, Mr. Castile's, and Ms. Bland's murders, and so many others, along with the immense daily struggle of living while Black in America. White people do not understand the emotional toll these murders and this history have on Black people. But part of becoming an anti-racist is to do everything we can to gain some understanding and to work hard to develop policies that produce an anti-racist environment. The first step is to acknowledge the emotional labor involved in work of this kind. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. And thank you to all our panelists for joining us this afternoon. So we're just gonna go ahead and jump on in. So on Tuesday, as I mentioned earlier, we utilized a historical lens to demonstrate that while the current resistance that we're seeing nationally and internationally in the form of protests is in part about police brutality, but we learned that there is a larger historical context to examine in understanding how centuries of federal, state, and local policies have resulted in this tangle web of racist systems that operate to disenfranchise communities of color. And even further, we learned that based on these systems, that people are conditioned to hear without listening and to spectate without seeing. But we also learned that anti-racism is absolutely necessary in dismantling these systems. But what does it mean to be anti-racist, and how do we define an anti-racist? And so this question is directed to all panelists, but we'll start with Brianne.
Thank you so much, Shaiba, for having all of us. It's so good to see these friendly faces again and to be with all of you. I am going to read off my notes that I scribbled last night, and I don't think there is one overarching definition of anti-racist or how to be an anti-racist, but I think it's a puzzle that we're all figuring out together, and we have people like Angela Davis and Ibram X. Kendi telling us and kind of leading the way. But the way I've started to think about anti-racism and being an anti-racist is it's an active, constant, and long-term commitment in word, thought, and deed to interrupting racism when you see it, when you think it, and then to mitigating any harm that's already been caused. That's kind of the framework I've been using. It's not perfect and it's not complete at all, but that's how I've been operating with it for a while.
Thanks, Brianne. Erin, do you want to weigh in? What is an anti-racist?
So it's funny that Brianne mentioned Angela Davis, because she has a quote that I love in terms of just how to think about anti-racism. This is Angela Y. Davis. She says, in a racist society, it is not enough to be non-racist. We must be anti-racist. And then goes on to define anti-racism as fighting against racism. But I think that in order to conceptually understand what fighting against racism means, you have to understand the different types of racism. So there's individual racism, which refers to the beliefs and attitudes, actions of individuals that support and perpetuate racism. So that might be confronting white superiority, those types of beliefs. Then there's interpersonal racism. So that might be witnessing racism that occurs between individuals, watching someone be bullied or targeted because of their race. Then there's institutional racism, which is when an organization or a system discriminates against someone. So maybe a school system where students of color are more frequently suspended. I saw that a lot in my work in juvenile justice. And then of course, structural racism, which is kind of the racial bias across all institutions and society. These are privileges given to white people resulting in disadvantages to Black people or people of color. And so I think understanding those definitions and all the different ways that racism looks truly helps one understand all the ways they can plug into being an anti-racist. So.
Thanks, Erin. Maya?
Here we go. Thanks, Taifa. Brianne leapt inside of my mind and leapt into my notes last night, because our thoughts and our sentiments on anti-racism mirror each other. So I think a large part of being anti-racist is the acknowledgement of racism and how it impacts the lives of racial minorities, Blacks, Asians, the Latinx community, all of them. But the greatest part about being an anti-racist is it's an active practice, right? Like I practice yoga, and it's not always consistent, but the practice is pushing me to be better and be consistent at my practice. The practice of being an anti-racist is continual. And so that's looking at both the actions and thoughts that you have and the actions and thoughts of others, and actively challenging those. That's the real work, is the active challenging part.
Thank you. Dr. Nabors?
Yes, thank you. My definition of anti-racism is taken largely from Ibram X. Kendi, in which, of course, he states that any action or behavior that does not promote anti-racism is racist. And I'm really, as a white man, I'm just trying constantly to work on that, right? What is my behavior or my action that is not promoting, right, anti-racism? What am I doing that is in fact racist and or promoting structures, right, that are perpetuating this system or these systems? And so, I mean, the definitions given by Brianne, Erin, and Maya are perfect, and that's I'm trying to listen, right, to what Black people, Indigenous people, people of color are saying about this, and applying that as often as I can in my daily life.
Thank you. I think based on everything that you all said, some key takeaways is understanding that this is a long journey, and understanding that Sometimes this work might be hard, but essentially it seems as though being an anti-racist results from the conscious decision to make frequent, consistent, equitable choices daily that operate to disrupt well-executed, deliberate, massive, interconnected racist systems that have been operated to oppress communities of color. And so it may seem a bit daunting for our attendees to attempt to bring down these massive structures and systems. Do you have any examples of anti-racist behavior that we can engage in based on the definitions that you've already supplied? And maybe we'll start with Erin for this one.
Sure. So a scenario when we were prepping for this presentation that came to mind for me is it even starts just in showing up for your Black friends or for other Black people you know. So I was in a class in high school, AP US history, and I was the only Black girl in the entire class, which that was problem number one. But of course we went to slavery and we started talking about that. And my very well-intentioned teacher, wanting me to feel, you know, like he wanted me to be part of the conversation, kept coming to me like, how do Black people feel about this? Or how do Black people feel about that? Or what are your thoughts, Erin? Sometimes it wasn't even necessarily evoking my race in the question, but it was just his way of trying to generate some thoughts that might be different from the majority of the class. Well, of course, no one wants to feel like a spokesperson for their entire race on any particular topic. And so I had a white classmate who noticed that I was kind of getting annoyed and who put her hand up and just said, hey, why do you always do that? Like, you know, I understand that her perspective is valuable, but have you, you know, thought about how that might make her feel to always have to be the person that speaks up on this? Like, that's not fair. So that's a concrete example. Another one might be really just interacting with people. If you see something, speak up, you know, in any context. That could be in the workplace. You might overhear colleagues asking a person of color, can I touch your hair? Like, no, pull that person aside and say, like, that is not a correct way to interact with someone. And so I really think it just means like when you see something, say something, speaking up and not letting Black people or people of color bear the brunt of having to navigate these spaces that make them uncomfortable. So.
Thank you, Erin. Maya?
So I think about a social situation that happened to me in high school. I grew up in a small rural town in Alabama, about 14,000 people. That is 60% white and about 35% Black. And so there was this group in high school called the Freelancers. And it was for lack of a better word, like a sorority of women or young girls. And it was predominantly white. There weren't any Black members of the Freelancers. But in certain years, like the it Black girl would be chosen. Now, I, you know, not to be braggadocious about myself, was the it Black girl of my class. And in years prior to that, I was very vocal about, I don't like this group because these people are racist. They actively seek to exclude Black girls and other racial minorities from their social settings. So I don't want to be a part of it. I had a very close white friend who was invited. I wasn't invited because clearly I said I didn't like the group, but I had a close friend of mine who was invited and chose not to accept because they wouldn't invite me. And going back to the thinking about this as yoga, the active practice, it wasn't performative because she didn't then come tell me, hey, I turned them down because they wouldn't let you in. She didn't shout that from the rooftops, hey, I turned those people down because they're racist. She did the act and she continued on about her life. I actually never found out. She and I have never spoken about it, even though I know about it, right? And thinking about like anti-racism as a continual exercise, just because you do one thing that's great doesn't mean that you're off the hook from other things. It's like, okay, that you got it right today, but here's something coming down the pipe tomorrow. And so how can you continue to demonstrate anti-racism in your life?
Thank you. And Jim?
Thank you. That's great. Thank you, Aaron and Maya. I have two lists. I have lists for the particular context of Wofford and for students and for faculty. Both of these lists, of course, aren't exhaustive, and all of the points on the lists were said to me by Black students, faculty, or staff at Wofford over the years. Okay, so for students, make time to educate yourself, as we've talked about. Show up at protests and marches. De-escalate white anger or defensiveness when you see it. Don't look to Black people or people of color to do it. Take the lead in dealing with angry or emotional white people. Call out racist behavior when you see it. Figure out a script, practice it, use it if that helps. If a faculty member singles out a Black student in class, call it out. If a faculty member says anything that could be construed as racist, call it out. Ask the faculty to clarify what they mean. Explain to them how it sounds to you. If the faculty member refuses or takes offense or gets defensive or accusatory or whatever, report the incident to the bias incident response team. Report any overtly racist incidents to the bias incident response team and follow through. If you see a syllabus that contains racist content that is not contextualized and in an educational way, call it out. Either bring your concerns to the faculty member, consult with this office, the ODI, or report it to the bias incident response team. Organize to get the back of the college memorial moved to a prominent location on campus. Organize to get the memorial to the enslaved builders of Old Main moved to a prominent location in Old Main. Organize to demand that a public acknowledgement of the land and labor history of Wofford be stated at every formal college occasion. Organize to demand that a public acknowledgement of the racial history of names be attached to Wofford's campus buildings. Organize to demand that all faculty be required to take annual anti-racist and anti-bias training, at least annual. Use your power, which is immense here, immense, to help make Wofford equitable and just. For faculty, reach out to other white faculty and invite them to talk about anti-racism. Take ownership of anti-racist practice. Do not rely on ODI or this office to deal with it. Share course content and syllabi with colleagues to look for racist content or structural racism. Organize departmental meetings, colloquia, symposia about equitable teaching practices. Invite Black, Indigenous, or people or other people of color professionals in equity to departmental meetings and pay them for their time. Commit departments to self-studies or external reviews that specifically address the racial climate. Identify racist policies on campus and work to dismantle them. Partner with BIPOC students and staff to identify and dismantle racist policies on campus. Reject the ideology of colorblindness and or neutrality in racial positions. These ideologies do not support anti-racist policies. Encourage or incentivize students to attend anti-racist events on campus and in the community. Be active in your community. Contact state, local, and county elected officials, municipal and county law enforcement, school board members, and demand anti-racist practices.
Thank you. Brianne, that's a hard act to follow, but what are some examples of anti-racist behavior?
I'll bring it down to the personal. So it is not my practice to applaud white people for doing the right thing, but I do have one childhood friend in particular who I think over the years has really put in a lot of work to practice anti-racism, as Maya says. His name is Michael Kushner, and he is big in the New York theater scene. You know, he does a lot of innovative things by himself, but he, I think, embodies a lot of the aspects of anti-racism in his life. And especially in the past few weeks, he's become more and more vocal. So he admits when he has been wrong. He, you know, has posted a lot on social media about times in the past where he has seen something and not said something, or he has witnessed racist phenomenon in the theater world and not intervened at that time. So he, you know, in speaking to his mostly white audience, he talks about all the ways he has failed in the past, very openly, very frankly, to kind of illustrate that interpersonal racism affects all of us, and there are always opportunities to intervene in your personal life. So he's very ready and humble and willing to admit his past blunders, because this is not a practice in which you're going to be perfect and there's no real finish line. There's no real finish line at all. It's an evolving thing. So he admits his wrongs. He also passes the mic, as I think a lot of us like to say. He has been elevating when he's not speaking to directly to his fellow white folks. He will repost things by people of color, specifically Black women for the most part, and Black queer folks. You know, he tries to expose his audience to more and more voices from the folks who are most impacted by racial injustice and all the other intersections of racial injustice that touch on homophobia and all the other ills that intersect with those. He tries to amplify those other people's voices as much as he can. And then finally, he has talked a lot about committing to his personal relationships. He, sent a bunch of folks a screenshot of, I think it was almost a 2-hour phone call during which, I think to his grandmother or someone very close in his family, during which he said at the beginning of this call, she was saying all lives matter and not understanding why that was misguided and violent. And then by the end of the almost 2 hours, his grandmother was able to understand and comprehend Black Lives Matter. And so that was 2 hours out of his, surely very busy day that he committed to someone in his life that he could convert, for lack of a better term. So I think he is doing his best in all of his spheres of influence to interrupt racism and talk about it, while also putting on the hat of passing the mic to folks who are most impacted. So I think he's doing a beautiful job, and it's something that is very, very difficult. But you have to start somewhere. And so I think he is taking what he has and doing with it really, really good things. And I'm excited to see how he grows from there and grows in his anti-racist practice. So that's just a personal example from my own life that I've seen.
Thank you. And so I'd also like to weigh in to provide our audience members with additional examples. So we've seen in Louisville, Kentucky, a line of white female demonstrators forming a barrier between Black protesters and the police. And so that's a behavior in using your power and privilege to protect our Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. Erin's example, Maya's example, and Brienne's example all demonstrated how occupying space and using your voice to uplift others is extremely important. One that I saw and really liked was a white man was walking by as a person of color was being stopped by the police, and he just stood across the street at a safe distance and just watched the entire interaction so that the police knew that someone else was watching, and in hopes that he could use his power and privilege to de-escalate the situation. Educating yourself, as our panelist said, is very important on the inequities that exist, and not relying on your friends of color to do that emotional labor for you. Speaking up in spaces and not staying silent is a very, very, very effective tool. Engaging in discussions, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes with your family members about issues that relate to anti-racism, is another good example. Realizing how much space you occupy and sharing that space with other Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. And so also checking in on your friends and making sure that they're okay is a very, very big gesture in anti-racism work, because it shows that you understand that something is happening in the world that is having a almost deleterious effect on your friends, and that's important too. Rearranging your regularly scheduled standing team meetings to a different time to allow your staff to attend anti-racism workshops like this one is also very helpful, because you're engaging in the work of dismantling dismantling racism and uplifting voices of marginalized folks as well. And so with that said, I want to transition to my co-moderator for the other portion of the panel discussion. So thank you all panelists. It is great to always see your lovely faces. I'm going to now yield to co-moderator Dr. Camille Bethay, chair of the Modern Languages Department and professor of Spanish at Wofford, to help contextualize these definitions and examples that we've already heard through a series of hypotheticals, and hear from our panelists as to how an anti-racist might respond in these instances.
Thank you, Dean Taifa, and thank you once again to our panelists for being here. So as Dean Taifa said, I'm going to suggest some scenarios or explain some scenarios, and then ask our panelists how a person can show up in this situation and show themselves to be anti-racist, or how an anti-racist might respond in this scenario. So the first scenario, we're going to start with the student scenario. A primarily white student Greek organization is hosting a party on campus on a Friday night. A group of students of color happen to pass by on their way to their residence hall, and they see a white friend of theirs waiting in line to get into the party. This friend convinces the students of color that they should go to the party as well. The white friend gets into the party with no problem, but the students of color are told that they'll need to provide their invitation to get in, even though the same was not asked of their friend who has already been allowed into the party. So how would an anti-racist respond to this situation, either as a witness to the situation or as a friend of the students of color? And we're going to start with Maya.
So, you know, in the grand scheme, if you are the white student outside of the party or in the party, in the grand scheme, like your attendance at that party is really not going to impact your life. Like maybe you might find the love of your life in there, but that's not likely the case. So the first way, which is, I'm going to acknowledge the difference between like performative acts and non-performative acts, and like that this is a continuing thing, right? So the first thing you can do is leave the party. Or if you're outside, not go to the party. Like stand in solidarity with your friends at that moment in time and say, I see how you're being treated. I acknowledge that, and I'm not going to participate or perpetuate this system of like, you know, asking you for your invitation. I'm just not gonna be a part of that. I'm gonna leave. But the follow-up step, like let's say that you are the part of the Greek organization who hosted the party. Think about the ways that you perpetuate racism within your organization. And this is for the Greeks, this is for any type of, you know, if you're a departmental chair, it could apply to you. Think about why you put a stipulation on like having Black students attend your party, right? And if making that change from that practice or that behavior just does not sit well in your gut, think about why. Why is it that if we invite a different race of people into our setting, why does that make me uncomfortable? That's the long-standing practice of being anti-racism that you're gonna have to confront. Why does it make me uncomfortable to invite this group of Black students here? I mean, yeah, it's open to everybody, but I don't really want them to come. You have to challenge that view that you hold within your own, you know, within yourself. The second part is, if you are part of this Greek culture that does not welcome Black students, you should work to change that. Think about those views, but also seek to learn how you can be better. Now, it's popular to, the popular thing is like, okay, let's go find our Black counterpart and let's like ask them all the questions and like have them tell us what we need to do. That, in my opinion, is not anti-racist work. And here's why. Because I think that action seeks to alleviate the ill, but not the true cause of what's going on. So it's like, I want to make myself feel better. I need somebody to tell me what I need to do to not be racist anymore. And then boom, I'm done. And that's not what this work is. And I think it also ignores the fact that you now put the burden on somebody else to tell you what you need to do. Like if I need to know the answer for something, I can Google, I can find all the academic resources, you know, racism is an interpersonal thing. And of course you want to go and connect with people who share that experience that you don't, but there are also many tools out there available to a generation that goes to Google to get every type of information that they need to know. So I would say partner with someone. You can put the request out there. If it's not accepted or reciprocated, you shouldn't feel any type of way. But then seek to listen and learn and challenge your own views about, why it makes you uncomfortable to invite this new group in.
That's very helpful information. Thank you, Maya. Did any of the other panelists want to weigh in briefly? No? Okay, we'll go to our second.
Wait, I think Aaron wanted to chime in.
I'm sorry, Aaron.
Okay, so the one thing I did just want to add quickly was just about the performative nature of sometimes being an anti-racist, and how to combat that. And I think it's important to check oneself when determining what your actions are for. Like, what is the real purpose of your action, right? So let's say this is the age of social media, building a hypothetical on a hypothetical, and your first response, because you're not a part of the organization and you don't know all the students who attended and you don't want to put them on blast, is to make a post on social media about what happened, right? My biggest check that you can, questions you can ask yourself is, in being an anti-racist and trying to assess whether my actions are performative, am I seeking to be an ally? Am I seeking to advocate for a policy change, or am I seeking applause? Because those, to me, are guiding questions. An ally means you want to let someone know that, like, what happened to you was not okay. I see this and I want to stand with you in the hurt that you're feeling, even though I can't exactly relate. Advocating would be advocating for a policy change. Black people aren't allowed at these parties. This is unjust. This is an injustice. I don't want this to continue being a thing. By making this post, there is a policy that can actually be changed by, like, me bringing other people into this conversation. And then there's applause. It's like literally wanting people to clap for you because you did something that was anti-racist. You want to go viral. You think that this might be a good thing for other people to see, but it's not really genuine. And I think that if you can answer that, the true reason for doing whatever this anti-racist act is that you believe is best in your heart, is for advocacy or to be an ally, I think that then you avoid being performative, or it's a better mechanism of doing that. So I just wanted to highlight that.
That's a great point. Thank you. Thank you, Erin. Okay, so our second scenario is, as a faculty member, I have heard from students of color who have been made to feel tokenized or othered, or that they're expected to speak for their entire race in the classroom. There have been instances where professors have wanted to amplify the voices of students of color in the classroom by asking them how members of a particular community may view a significant event or occurrence in that community. So in this hypothetical scenario, during a summer session 2 course, a professor asks or calls on the only Black student in the class, and this is something that Aaron alluded to earlier, mentioned earlier, to discuss how members of the Black community feel about the recent protests taking place in response to centuries of abuses, which ultimately led to the killing of George Floyd. How would an anti-racist respond to a Black student being put in this situation? And we're gonna have Jim weigh in first.
Thanks, Camille. I mean, I thought Aaron's response was, terrific, and would model what she said. I mean, but I wrote up a little sort of scenario to indicate sort of different sort of layers again of response that are echoing what Maya was laying out as well. Well, here I'd love to hear what my co-panelists think about this, of course. So a white student could raise her hand and say, I don't think that's a fair question. I don't know whether the student wants to answer, but I think it's unfair to call on him because he's Black. And then let's say the professor gets defensive and says it's reasonable to ask a Black student to respond to questions about his people. And then the white student again could say it's unfair. And then if the Black student were to say something or to indicate in some way that he's uncomfortable, right? Perhaps he says he doesn't want to answer the question, or he doesn't answer the question. And the professor persists, and the Black student doesn't respond. You know, a different white student could say that, you know, the Black student just said he doesn't want to, or is indicating that he doesn't want to respond, and ask the professor to move on, right? Or to call attention to the fact that it's not fair to ask someone to speak for, you know, their race in that sense. And then a different white student could say, could ask the Black student at that point, or someone could ask the Black student at that point, if he minds that they respond, right? And if the student agrees, then a white student could talk about their experience at a protest march, or their experience in a different class, right? In which something like this came up again, to try and bring the attention to, again, the kind of structural racist work that's going on at that moment. And then perhaps after class, a white student could approach the Black student and ask how they feel, how that person feels about what happened, and perhaps could offer to work with that student in some way that could address what was going on, which would include, hopefully, again, bringing this to a bias incident response team for reporting that way. So trying to address sort of different levels. I mean, what's so tricky about this, of course, it seems to me, please correct me if I'm wrong, is that, you know, well-intentioned white students in that room might want to intervene, but intervention should not occur, you know, at the expense or in a way that silences the Black student, right, in any way, right? So it's intervene, but wait for cues or indications or words from the Black student about how they're feeling at that point.
Thank you, Jim. I think that's very helpful. For the sake of time, we'll move on to our next scenario. But Erin mentioned this situation before, and it's helpful to have the information that you've both shared with us. So our third scenario, the silencing of Black voices and perspectives has been utilized as part of the systems of oppression that continue to perpetuate racism. We saw this, for example, in the temporary glitch on TikTok that resulted in the hashtag Black Lives Matter and George Floyd having 0 views. We see it in the authorship in academia as well, and in boardrooms during team meetings, for example. In this hypothetical, I want you to imagine that during a committee meeting, a person of color proposes a great idea that is immediately shut down by a few members of the committee. Interestingly enough, though, a white colleague notices that the idea was brilliant, and in realizing that their colleague of color has been silenced, suggests the same idea. So did the white colleague engage in anti-racist behavior by suggesting this idea? And how should the other committee members have responded? And we're gonna have Brianne answer this question.
Oh, there it is. So I think that this was almost anti-racist, and I think oftentimes this is very close, but still a miss. To me, the critical missing piece in the white colleague trying to repeat the idea is that colleague did not point to the passer, right? The ideal intervention would have been, well, actually, that was Kayla. This is Kayla's idea. I thought Kayla's idea was excellent, and here's why. And why don't we hear more from her about her idea? I think giving credit where credit is due and naming whose idea has been shut down and who's been silenced is probably the most important and powerful part of this scenario that was missing as it stands. And I think that as for the other committee members, because of the way systems work, I would not trust the other committee members to have recognized the hypothetical Kayla's idea coming out of the mouth of Sarah, right? Like I'm very confident that the committee would not have made the connection that this is an idea we just heard from a different mouth. And because the messenger is different, now suddenly it's palatable. So I think the critical intervention to be made is to name who's been silenced, credit them with the idea or the work that's happening, and then, as I kind of said before, pass the mic back to the original person who had the idea. I think that that's how I would approach that in the moment. And then I think afterward, the white colleague can email whoever is the head of this committee or figure out a way to communicate that this committee is silencing its members, its marginalized members, and that's something that needs to be addressed and worked on as a group. So it's at least 2 parts. I'm sure there are 6 other things that my other panelists might be able to recommend, but those are the 2 that jumped out at me the most critically.
Okay, did anyone else want to briefly comment on that one? No? Okay, we'll have our last scenario, and this is one that several of the participants have asked about. So in the registration process for this session, we asked our attendees whether they had specific questions for our panelists. There were lots of questions regarding how to have productive conversations about race with friends and family members. So I posed this final hypothetical to you all. Imagine that you have finally come face to face with your Aunt Jean during Thanksgiving, who all summer long has been posting or had been posting and reposting some racist things about the protest, who still has All Lives Matter plastered across her Facebook page. And she's also said some things that you now know to be false based on attending Anti-Racism 101 sessions over the last several months. As you reach for the mashed potatoes, Aunt Jean says, "I don't know why they made George Floyd out to be a martyr. That officer was wrong for doing what he did, but Mr. Floyd was a criminal." So how would an anti-racist respond in this situation? And we're gonna start with Erin.
So I think this scenario is really important because it's so multidimensional, first off. But the main question I would start with, because I think this is so important when engaging with people and like conserving your energy, is Aunt Jean ignorant or does she enjoy racism? Like, because those are 2 very different questions, right? If Aunt Jean is somebody who just really does not know because our communities are very segregated, she doesn't interact with a lot of Black people, you know, she may only watch Fox News as her sole source of getting any information, then maybe Aunt Jean is just ignorant. She can be redeemed. We can give her more information. But if Aunt Jean is someone who just likes being racist, enjoys hatred, then I think that's a different conversation that takes a different approach, because it's like, what is there to gain by arguing with this person? Now, another aspect is the idea, of course, that actions are going to speak louder than words, but words can still kill. And I think that's an important distinction. So we look at Amy Cooper and like the way she kind of like weaponized her words to essentially almost get this Black man killed by the police, like if it had been believed in the way that she asserted her distress, right? And so I think that because an Aunt Jean could potentially be an Amy Cooper, it's important to address her words and to check her and to say something. But at the end of the day, your actions matter more. So maybe it's a matter of you ensure that she understands what she's doing is wrong, but then you don't waste a lot of time. How do you show up in the world with your deeds to be anti-racist post this conversation? Is if Aunt Jean follows you on social media, is it posting a lot more? Because you know she's gonna see it, right? But not wasting a lot of time. And so the last thing I would say is kind of this 3-fold approach. It's like, say your piece, choose your personal piece, and then exercise your privilege to be anti-racist in real life. Because ultimately, the dining room table doesn't matter that much. The world's racist. So there are lots of opportunities for you to show up. And in terms of actually engaging with her at the table, I actually called one of my good white friends and asked her, like, I know this has happened to her. She is from Georgia. She has these conversations all the time. I'm like, what do you do in these situations? Because this doesn't happen to me. So I wanted to get a real approach to this. And what she said was, I use a questions approach. I just start asking questions with my ignorant relatives who may not be truly racist people, but they are ignorant. I say, where did you get this information? Did you know that, white people also commit crime? Why does it bother you? The man has perished. Why does it bother you that he would be used as a martyr? How does that harm you? Using like leading questions to engage in this conversation that's unpacking, to what degree this person is basing their opinion on things that are untrue. So I think those are like my primary suggestions.
Thank you. Did any of the other panelists want to comment? Brianne?
I think every point Erin made makes complete sense. And I think just, again, something to remember is that conversation at the table, it doesn't end there. And you might not get something satisfying out of that one conversation, right? That has to be the start of probably multiple conversations with Aunt Jean. At the table, on the phone, like that will just be kind of be opening the door into probably a very protracted process of getting her to come around. And it's going to be hard. And I think anti-racist work sometimes requires sacrifice of relationships that might normally have thrived because they were permissive of racism and of other like ills and isms. So I think it takes a very, very deep commitment to this work, and it will threaten some of your relationships, and it will make things awkward potentially. And so you have to decide for yourself, what are you willing to put on the line to further this work? And that is a deeply personal conversation that you have to have with yourself, but know that just that one conversation is probably not gonna give you a lot of feel-good rewards as an anti-racist. It's gonna be just the start of many conversations. And you may never win Aunt Jean over, and that's okay, because all the work you've done still matters. That is not the point to give up and say, oh God, I tried, but it's too much, too hard. I'm gonna just donate my money and call that and make that be the end of the work that you do. So I don't think anyone is pretending that this work is easy, but it is necessary. And if you're committed, then know what you're signing up for and keep it up.
Thank you, Brianne. Looking at the time, I'm gonna hand this back off to Dean Taifa now. Thank you all for your great answers and for giving very practical advice for what people can do and when they find themselves in these situations, when they commit themselves to being anti-racist.
So thank you again to our panelists and my friends for your insight on what tools, skills, and approaches to how we can actively become anti-racist. I know that there are a couple of questions. I want to get to this one question first, and I'm going to open it up to all the panelists to answer. The question is, why is all lives matter inappropriate? Okay, we'll start with Brianne.
I can take a first crack at. Unfortunately, this is a question that we have been answering, at least on the internet, right, for like 5 years. So it's difficult even to remember all the different ways it's been explained. So I'm going to try to remember the ones that have stuck out to me most. So the problem with all lives matter, right, is that it's not true. It is a false statement currently. It is aspirational. I would love for all lives to matter, but currently they don't. And so that phrase, that all lives matter phrase, was specifically crafted as a response to Black Lives Matter. Like, it is not, no one was saying all lives matter prior to 2014, maybe 2015 or so. So you got to understand the origin of the phrase, that it is specifically meant to silence folks who are saying Black Lives Matter, silence folks who are trying to bring attention to the various different injustices that Black people specifically are facing. So it's a phrase that erases centering people who are going through struggles, and it is a nonsense phrase almost, right? Black Lives Matter is an affirmation, and it is aspirational too, but it is Black Lives Matter as a phrase has action attached to it. All Lives Matter is meant to quell and keep people content and keep people from pointing out the issues. So I think for a lot of folks who are kind of away from these internet conversations, All Lives Matter seems like a really, like the we're all human kind of approach, the right thing to say. And it's in fact not. It's violent when you meet someone saying Black Lives Matter or Trans Lives Matter or Indigenous Lives Matter with an All Lives Matter statement. You are essentially quashing and quelling the fight for racial justice. And so I would be very, very thoughtful about what you think All Lives Matter really means. You know, all lives should matter, but right now they don't. So until they do, we can't say that. That's just, I think that's it. I hope I summed it up. I definitely welcome Maya and Erin to supplement.
Yeah, Erin, can you contextualize what Brianne is saying for us when she's saying all lives don't matter, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can look at any of the things that brought forth the Black Lives Matter movement, right? Like, we wouldn't literally have the hashtag if Black folks weren't getting murdered by police. And it's like year 5 of Black Lives Matter. This has been happening since slavery, since slave patrols, since all of the things historically that you all probably learned about in some of the previous sessions. So I won't belabor that point. But I think to just from a basic human empathy perspective, it should not bother you if you believe all lives matter to say that Black Lives Matter. It shouldn't bother you because honestly, if my house was on fire and I go to the fire department and I say, please send help, and they respond to me with all houses matter, that's not empathy. That's not basic human decency. If I'm getting a lung transplant, the surgeon's not going to cut me open and then be like, actually, all organs matter. Like, no, that's not how this works. So I think that look at it less of, even if you can't get behind it for whatever your personal, like it makes you uncomfortable. Are you human? Do you have empathy? If you believe that all lives matter, then in this moment, you should have no objection to being able to firmly state that Black Lives Matter right now when it is such a pressing moment to say that out loud.
Yeah. I think initially when we spoke about racism, all of us had something along the lines of acknowledge and then do the work. And I echo everything that Erin and Brianne have mentioned on the point, but I want to connect this to something that I see so often in the South is this notion of I don't see color. Because in the same way that All Lives Matter acts as a way to quell the dissent or whatever Black Lives Matter brings, I think I don't see color does the same thing too. And we should also note that like well-meaning Black and white people use this phrase. I think we all should stop using it because I don't see color ignores the nuances of the lives that I live as a Black person, the life that you live as a white person. You should see somebody's color because it's there. This is a reality of our existence, but you should also not be racist because of what you see. And so that is it's the action that we're focusing on now. It's not these euphemisms of all lives matter and I don't see color. It's like, what is your work really telling us that you're doing? Are you working to be anti-racist, or are you trying to ignore the reality that we all face? Like that's the even greater insult to this work, is saying that this work doesn't need to be a thing because the problem doesn't exist. Of course it does. You may not see it, but acknowledging that it's something that affects the lives of racial minorities matters a lot.
Thank you.
And maybe racial minorities is an outdated term because, demographics, changing demographics and all.
There is one other question that I hope we can get to really briefly. There's a question about the professor singling out a Black student. Would another student using a diversion tactic versus a confrontation tactic be considered anti-racist? Erin?
There we go. So one of the things that I wanted to know, even in my example that I gave, was that like the student who spoke up for me knew me, right? Like she did know me. We'd had conversations. So she knew my personality. She knew a little bit about who I am and how I respond, she could tell I was uncomfortable. There's another way you can make a person of color uncomfortable, and that's sometimes by putting them on the spot, right? About like, you don't know this person, and you're in a class, a lecture hall of maybe 100 people where they're already feeling tons of anxiety, and then saying, interrupting their attempt to answer the question, even though you don't feel like it's right, and saying like, she shouldn't have to answer that. Like, I think that it's nuance. If you know this person, I know everybody has phones in class, send a little, I didn't really like that. Is that something like, I might go up to the teacher after class and just address it. Or if you really can't tell because you really don't know, maybe you email the professor after class and say, you know what, I don't know if this made so-and-so uncomfortable, but it really made me uncomfortable, and here's why. So you're not even making it about the student's discomfort, you're making it about your discomfort, that you don't ever want a Black student to be made to feel like they're on the spot. And so I do think that it's more nuanced than just speak up. And I did want to make that point clear, that Blackness is not a monolith. So the ways that people feel about race, their political leanings, all of these things can vary. I just know that for me in that situation with that particular individual, it was the right approach and it made me feel affirmed. So.
All righty. So now that we're at time, I also want to recognize the organizers of these anti-racism sessions. So Dr. Jim Nabors, Dr. Rhiannon Libre, Dr. Camille Bethea, Dr. Kim Roston, Dr. Kimberly Hall, Dr. Tasha Smith Tyus, Professor Jessica Scott Felder, Tiara Woney, and our lovely host, Nadia Glover. As colleagues, we have committed to hosting these virtual sessions throughout the summer and look forward to seeing you all there then. In the meantime, we have curated a list of resources that will be made available to you over the course of the summer in developing your anti-racist skills, and we'll provide those resources via email. So this concludes the panel and Q&A portion of our program, and I cannot thank you enough to our panelists. For those of you who indicated you wanted to engage in optional breakout discussions, our host is going to begin that process now. In the breakout rooms, you will have up to 30 minutes to debrief and discuss the session. After your discussion, the anti-racism organizer assigned to your room will dismiss you from the session, so you don't have to return here to the main room. So thank you all for coming and for engaging in this work.
Yes, again, thank you so much for everyone coming and for all of our speakers today. I'm going to move you all into our breakout rooms now, and I'll see you there.